So a couple of months ago, I started an autonomous research project with Claude Code. I gave Claude a topic for a research project and set up a system whereby it would basically work autonomously on an open-ended research project. And today I've released those results to the public, to anybody who's interested. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about it. Since the website I'm releasing is completely written by I wanted to describe it a little bit from the human perspective. So I got interested in this, well, the idea of to what extent AI can do research autonomously and what the implications of that are for sort of the research process or research community. A couple of years ago, there's a company in Tokyo called Sakana AI that released a paper called AI Scientist, in which they set up a system whereby an AI model would come up with a research plan, research the previous literature, actually do an experiment that involved writing code and testing the code and getting the results, and then writing it up in as a final paper in the format of a research paper. And their first experiment in 2024, it looked superficially okay, but when they had the papers reviewed by experts, the ratings were not very high. But the following year, they did that again, and this time they were able to get a paper actually accepted to a conference through peer review. And they reported on that research earlier this year, earlier in 2026, in a paper published in the journal Nature. Also, this year in 2026, Andrei Karpathy released a couple of sort of frameworks. One was called Auto Research, kind of a simple framework, but very easy to understand and applicable with AI, in which you set up a system where AI does some experiments and then evaluates the results and rates the better results. And the experiments that get the better the results, it then applies whatever methods were used for that in sort of a system of recursive improvement. And so all of the reports I'd heard about these sort of autonomous, self-improving research projects were in the sciences, in fields in which there's a fairly objective metric for measuring the results and then feeding back those results into the research process. But when I was working full-time at the university, I was mostly supervising research in the humanities or the social sciences, where the results are, are a bit fuzzier, they're more difficult to quantify, but they're still important. They yield valuable insights. And so beginning earlier this year, well, not long after, I think it was Claude 4.5 that was released towards the end of 2025, that programmers and software developers and others noticed that it was now becoming able to take on autonomous tasks and carry out much longer-term projects. And so there was kind of a turning point at that point in the software development area. And so I was trying that. I was playing with that some. And I also was saying what could be done with research as well, too. Would it be possible for someone like me, without the resources of a company like Sakana AI, to develop a system for doing the full research process from end to end? Not necessarily because I wanted to yield good research, is I want to know what is possible for people to do, and what are the implications of that for the graduate school process, the research evaluation process, peer review, publications, and things like that. So sort of the whole research community process. Because if AI systems can do the whole research process on their own, that has big implications for human researchers and the human research environment. And so I think it was in March or April of 2026 this year, I did some sort of private projects. I had one where it kind of imitated the AI scientist system, except in the humanities and the social sciences, where the system would, do some research, do some reading in literature in various fields, and and come up with research topics, and using publicly available sources, find papers about it, and then do the collect data to come up with a research question, come up with a research methodology, do it, and then in those early projects, which I have not released and I will not release, it ended up producing actual papers, formatted papers that looked like research papers. The quality, from my point of view, I didn't show them to anybody or just a couple of people, but it was not great, but it was clear that it can be done. Okay, so if I had spent more time monitoring the process and improving the process, and also giving the models access to more of the literature that they could not get online, because a lot of websites these days are blocking Claude and ChatGPT from accessing the site, so they weren't able to get as much data as I was able to get. But I could see that this was a potential, that something that people who are doing research and supervising research need to be aware of. And so I kind of left it like that. I went a couple of months, but then I think it was in early June, I was scheduled to give some talks at Hiroshima University here in Japan on AI and research and AI and education. So I set up another system, kind of an open-ended research project, but it was intended to run for just a few days. And so I ran it, and I reported about it verbally at those lectures. And the question I came up with was the meaning of meaning. Okay, in other words, so words have meaning, grammatical constructions have meaning, other things have meaning. What does meaning mean? So there are a lot of different ways of thinking about meaning, a lot of different definitions of it. I myself have been interested in that question because I worked for many years as a translator, and especially as a lexicographer, editing dictionaries. And so dictionaries are books that explain the meanings of words. And so not in a deep philosophical sense, but in a very practical sense, I had struggled with what do words mean. And so one of the issues since the arrival of these large language models is that they seem to be able to handle meaning. We seem to be able to talk to them and convey meaning back and forth. But of course, it's a big issue. It's a big question. What are we actually doing in that case? But it really changes the landscape of this question of meaning, because prior to that, meaning had been an entirely human phenomenon. So whether you thought of human meaning as a cognitive phenomenon, a speaker's intention for what the word means, or how a listener perceives what a word means, or how the meaning is constructed through dialogue and conversation, whatever the definition of meaning that you preferred before, it was always on the assumption that it was humans doing it. And now we have these very unhuman things that are also able to handle meaning in some sense. And so that was the question I gave to Claude, beginning in late May 2026. I had it running for a few days. For the first few days, it was just set up so that it would be, I would be working with it. You could ask me questions and things like that. And so it made a lot of advances in those few days. But then once I went off to Hiroshima, I gave my talk, I kind of left it behind. And then I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was when Fable was released for the first time, or maybe it was when Opus 4.8 was released, but it was a couple of weeks later. I was thinking about how can I test this new model. I think it was 4.8. And so I decided to resume this process, but this time make it completely autonomous. So in other words, I would no longer be serving as an informant for the AI about human judgments about meaning or anything like this. I just said, AI, you do the work. And so I set up this process, and it evolved a little bit over the next few weeks. But basically, every day, Claude would wake up every 4 hours. I scheduled what's called a routine, and it would read a prompt, and it would continue this research process. And all I had given it at the beginning was, well, the tools to do the work, and then a basic prompt. You're doing research and you're going to approach this question of meaning in the age of AI from both the philosophical perspective and from kind of an empirical, experimental perspective. And I gave it a little money to spend on other models that it could access through OpenRouter, up to $5 per day. And so it just went off. And so it went off working. And I would peek in on what it was doing, and it was obviously doing things. And it did things on its own initiative. So one thing, for example, it started doing experiments where it would send sentences to models in which maybe one word was changed in order to evaluate how the models rated the changes in meaning or grammaticality or something like that. And these experiments it did were based on papers that it had found in the literature of human written research about various issues related to semantics and meaning. And this was all done on its own. I did not tell it to do experiments like that. And so it designed the experiments and it carried them out and analyzed the results. And it compiled all of its both experimental results and its philosophical ruminations in a wiki that was built on also another thing devised by Andrej Karpathy called LLM Wiki. And as it kept grew and grew, it grew and grew. And so I let it keep going. And then yesterday, I got a message from Claude saying, well, for the last 4 or 5 sessions, we're just spinning our wheels, haven't advanced at all. So what would you like to do? Essentially. And so I looked at what it was done, and I asked it to give me some options for moving ahead. And I decided, well, it's gone far enough. So I asked it to write up a report in easy to understand language about what this project had been doing and what its point was. The reason I emphasize easy to understand language is that its reports to me every day about what it was doing were becoming increasingly hard for me to understand. Okay, so it was using all this terminology, some technical terminology I didn't know, some that it seemed to be creating terminology itself to describe the research it was doing. And I couldn't follow that. It would have taken hours to go through the wiki, but it provided a quite easy to understand and quite interesting report at the end. And so that's what I've released today. I've also released the entire GitHub repository that contains all of its work for the last 2 months. So the project is written entirely, the report is written entirely by Claude. All of the research was written by Claude. I was just this kind of mostly hands-off supervisor. And I'm releasing this just to show people this is a level of research that can be done by AI on its own now with, with a problem to look at and access to the web and some tools to run programs and to do things like that, which increasingly more and more agentic systems are available that can do that. I will let those of you who are interested, to look at the paper, to look at the report and look at the data. My feeling is that it looks really good. I supervised, a dozen or so PhD theses in various language-related fields. I served on a lot of other PhD theses committees. If somebody had, first of all, the report is not in the form of a thesis, but if somebody had submitted this project as 5 years ago, say, as this is a research project I want to do, this is what I want to do, and they submitted it in an application for graduate school, we would have snapped that person up. Okay, so I can't remember ever seeing a research proposal as well thought out and as this one seems to be. Okay, so it really raises the bar, so to speak, on what research that can be done. And let me repeat, this is in a sort of a humanities field. It's kind of philosophical. It's partly linguistics. There's some rigor to its reasoning as well too, but it's not something where the results can be quantifiably, verified with complete accuracy or complete objectivity. but several things are very interesting about it. You read the report and you read its research. It's very modest in its claims. Told it to at the beginning. I said, don't make any extreme claims. Report what happens. So it's very upfront about reporting negative results, experiments that failed. It set up a system where it would try to avoid polluting its own experimental design with, in other words, it tried not to push positive results that were not justified. Okay, and this is, to be honest, this is not, fairly rare in the case of human research. So even the most objective scientists, and especially in fields like language education, a field I worked in a lot, researchers have theses they want to prove. They have points they want to make. And so they often kind of start their research with a conclusion to some extent, and then they work backwards and justify their conclusion. And even in the harder sciences, the more empirical sciences, people, they take a position. This is the theory I've established. I'm going to stick with that theory. So scientists and other researchers fall into groups about what they believe. And so I don't see any of that in Claude's reasoning, as near as I can tell. It thinks, well, what can I find? What is not true? What is, and it hedges constantly, and it's very, very cautious in its claims. But if you read the report, it seems to have yielded a few insights. There's a few insights about what models are doing, what language models are doing when they handle meaning. I haven't verified it. I haven't proven it. But I don't think I would not be. I don't think this is all just some hallucination. This is all just a prediction of tokens. It has no meaning. Okay, so I think what it does looks quite good. There might be some fundamental flaws in there. Or there might be some, and certainly there could be, disagreements about the approach to the problem itself. But I think as an example of what can be done by an AI model working by itself, really raises a big issue for the research community, including in fields in the humanities. So a lot of the discussion about the use of AI in research for the past few years has been focused just on the writing of papers, right? Did somebody use ChatGPT to write this paper or not, right? And using, these checking software to identify the use of M dashes or the use of delve or load bearing, that's a word that Claude likes. And so this goes beyond that. Okay, so this is the case where the research itself is done by the AI, and this also is different from a lot of, if you see people like Sam Altman or Dennis Hassabis talk about AI, they always say, well, these advances in AI, we're going to be able to cure cancer, maybe, right? And maybe, but they focus on the sciences where there's this clear benefit for humanity, and in the cases of the humanities and social sciences, that's not necessarily the goal of research, right? Often it's the research process itself that is more important. And also in universities, right, if somebody's writing a paper as an undergraduate or even a master's thesis, the purpose of that research is not so much to contribute to the stock of human knowledge and to advance the sciences. It's to as a education process for the researcher, and also as to show that researchers' ability to do a long extended project on their own. And so that's why we've traditionally evaluated students and researchers based on the products that they produced. And so a project like this that I produced, well, it doesn't tell you anything about me. Okay, it doesn't show that I'm a deep thinker about this process. I've learned a little bit about the process of setting up an AI system to do autonomous research, but nobody should hire me as to teach or to supervise research in this field of linguistic philosophy, which I think what this is. I don't have the background in that. I haven't done the background reading. Okay, I only know what I've read from what Claude produced. So that's raises a big issue. So I'm really, I'm sure it's starting to appear in around the world. There are papers being submitted to papers being submitted to conferences and to journals and for degrees that look really good or look sufficiently good, and but the author cannot explain them and doesn't understand them because they were done largely by AI. So this is an issue. Okay, so I'm throwing this out. Anybody who's interested in these particular issues, think about it. Please understand, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to get any credit. I'm not trying to pad my CV by doing this. I don't expect to earn any money from this, certainly. But I would be very interested if anybody wants to talk about it. If anybody has ideas about this or would like to have any discussions about it, I'm very interested in discussing the implications of this issue. So if you watched this video all the way to the end, I thank you very much. So that's all.